The last journey of Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations. The Cold War is at its height. Both East and West are trying to implant their ideologies on a young Africa which is emerging from colonialism. Hammarskjöld is there to mediate and will die because of the job he holds. His last writings reveal the fragility of the UN position and the stress under which he finds himself. Will the chaos in Africa precipitate a world war? Will the struggle for Katanga be the UN's downfall? Every means is justified to end the war conducted by Belgian mercenaries from France and Germany against UN troops, against us and the Congo. Every means is justified, even a ceasefire. The United Nations must not be allowed to be defeated by Chombi, the Belgian straw doll and British protégé. But how can the UN withstand their pressure? Who will save the United Nations mission?
The time for the flight to the Katanga province was on the 17th of September 1961 at 5:05 in the afternoon by a plane with a Swedish crew of 6 very experienced men and 10 other passengers, legal and political advisors, bodyguards, his secretary, and so on. As to Dag Hammarskjöld, he was surely very strained and stressed.
Tired and lonely, tired till your brains hurt, fingers numb, knees trembling. Now's the time. Now you must not fail.
This was a dangerous expedition, dangerous physically, and also, of course, it was dangerous and delicate from a political point of view. There was nothing unusual about the departure. We stood chatting on the tarmac. We commented on the fact that the plane had been shot at actually the day before without apparently the fuselage being seriously damaged. And we were wondering whether the rumors were right that white mercenaries were behind this shooting. Because there was an international riffraff in the service of Chombi being paid to make life as difficult for the UN people as possible and possibly drive us out from the Congo. Well, we went into the plane, sat down, were ready for takeoff, when he suddenly said, you know, I wonder whether it's wise for us both to leave at this stage when the central government in the Congo is so wobbly. Neither of us then would be able to control what happens in the capital during the absence. So I said, well, I stay behind with pleasure, because I had been against this mission from the beginning, knowing Chombe well enough, I thought, not ever to trust either him or his advisors in the background. So I stepped down from the plane, and Hammarskjöld was kind enough to accompany me. We stood talking again for a few minutes, and then he disappeared. And I realized, of course, the day after, that in this way he actually saved my life.
Would you please repeat after me? I, Dag Hammarskjold, solemnly swear to exercise in all loyalty, discretion, and conscience.
I, Dag Hammarskjold, solemnly swear to exercise in all loyalty, discretion, and conscience.
the functions entrusted to me as Secretary General of the United Nations.
The functions entrusted to me as Secretary General of the United Nations.
To discharge those functions and regulate my conduct with the interests of the United Nations only in view.
To discharge those functions and regulate my conduct with the interests of the United Nations only in view.
And not to seek or accept instructions in regard to the performance of my duties from any government or other authority external to the organization.
And not to seek or accept instructions in regard to the performance of my duties from any government or other authority external to the organization.
There was at that time, of course, the Cold War at its very coldest, meaning that there was a polarization between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. And each bloc used the internal chaos to foster their own interests, paying off this party or that party, this tribe or that tribe, so that they rose against each other. Everybody outside of Africa who had the means to export arms was extremely interested in doing so and making handsome profit. The tension became so great that I know that the Secretary General, who was, I needn't say that, but he was very, very sort of cautious in his statements to both the Security Council and General Assembly, nevertheless didn't hesitate to say that he feared there might be an international war caused by all those tensions, not only fighting inside the Congo.
Independence for the Belgian Congo. After centuries of Belgian control, King Baudouin grants the Congo home rule. Yet no sooner has the coveted freedom finally been achieved than Belgian paratroopers are forced to intervene to tackle looters. Mr. Chombe, governor of the province of Katanga, secedes from the Congo, under the protection of Belgian officers assisting Chombe and his young army. But communist elements and the UN become involved, and Chombe's Katangan army fights back with fierce determination. Law and order are restored.
There were very large interests involved in the Congo, not least economic ones, because the country, and particularly Katanga, was very rich in minerals. Katanga produced most of the world's cobalt, about 10% of its copper, much else besides, including uranium, which was used in the nuclear weapons program of the West. And for these reasons, the West was very keen to maintain order in the Congo so that its companies, its Western-based companies, could continue to produce minerals and to ensure that those minerals would not move in the direction of the Eastern Bloc. At this time, Hammarskjöld was under very strong pressure from the West, and particularly from Britain, who took the lead. This was because Britain was worried that what the UN was doing in Katanga would upset the good order which had thus far been maintained there. She therefore sent a government minister, the Marquis of Lansdowne, to the Congo to put strong pressure on Hammarskjöld to negotiate a ceasefire, and to warn him that if he didn't, Britain would consider withdrawing her political and financial support from the UN operation. And Britain also pressed the United States successfully to make representations to the Secretary General along these lines. And Hammarskjöld gave in under this pressure and agreed to go to a meeting in northern Rhodesia with Chombe, where the Marquis of Lansdowne would be waiting for him. And it was on his way to that meeting that he was killed.
1 week before his death, Dag Hammarskjöld wrote a letter, which was later to be known as his will, to a close friend of his, instructing him what to do as to the appointment of an executor of both his will and other economic transactions, and also telling him what to do with his private papers. Dag Hammarskjold was at that time 56 years old, full of vitality, building a home for his retirement in the southernmost part of Sweden and so on. Full of vitality, I repeat. Nevertheless, he felt that the situation in the Congo was so full of dangers, both in a physical sense for all UN members and in a more general sense as regards the UN Charter and all the ideas he stood up for. There were attacks after attacks every day against the United Nations.
And around the edges of town, heavy fighting continues. Each day since the fighting began, more UN troops have been brought into the battle. In the forest around the city, troops have dug in a defense perimeter, and the United Nations estimates that 120 Katangans have been killed. Most of the casualties were inflicted by heavy mortar fire. Reports to date indicate little hand-to-hand fighting, but a number of mortar and armored car duels. Hospitals and parts of the residential area have been badly damaged. Worst hit was Prince Leopold African Hospital.
Hammarskjöld was confronted with a very complicated situation. On the one hand, there was the increasing tension among the Cold War parties. There was crisis over Cuba, there was crisis over Berlin, a summit meeting had failed, the U-2 spy plane had been shot down, the American presidential election created uncertainty. On the other hand, Hammarskjöld was very committed to Africa. He had been touring Africa. He had a strong feeling that Africa was beginning to move, that there was an intense interest to create strong states for the welfare of the societies in order to remedy some of those colonial effects that Africa had been a victim of for several hundreds of years. There was also the mining interests, Congo being rich in many types of resources. And of course, Congo was very central in Africa as such, and what would happen to Congo would be precedent for what could happen to many other parts of Africa. So he wanted to connect the United Nations to the aspirations of the Africans to avoid becoming a battlefield in the Cold War, avoid being a victim of Western colonial intervention, and avoid being exposed to tribal confrontations which could endanger the states as a whole.
I think the crucial feature was his capacity to combine a firm grip on reality with ideals and visions that could inspire people. At the United Nations, this capacity enabled him to launch an array of innovative diplomatic methods that offered solutions to seemingly intractable problems. His father was a recognized lawyer, holding public offices both internationally and here in Sweden in the government up to the level of Prime Minister during the First World War. During Hammarskjöld's formative years, he resided as governor of Uppsala in this impressive castle.
It was very Lutheran. The Swedish austerity was visible in all its splendor in this castle. You can understand why, when his father was governor there, the rooms were so cold, without any decorations or wallpaper, all very austere. You can understand how Dag Hammarskjöld's character was formed, how austere and rigorous it was.
et la rigueur de son caractère.
Another important element of Hammarskjöld's upbringing was his religious orientation. His mother was a deeply religious person whom Hammarskjöld once described as holding radical democratic views with warm human undercurrents. The depth of Hammarskjöld's own religiousness became known only after his death, through the publication of his diary markings. It revealed that he was himself committed to these moral standards, and these moral standards later helped him both in personal crises and in during the pressures he was exposed to in the United Nations.
I bring to this task a firm will to devote myself without any reserve to the work carried out by the United Nations organization in pursuit of its high aims. I am here to serve you all. In so doing, I shall count on your understanding, on your advice, and on your will to give to what I have to say the attention that it may deserve. I am animated by a desire to meet all problems with an open mind. It is for you to judge how I succeed. It is for you to correct me if I fail. My work shall be guided by this knowledge.
When Hammarskjöld took over the organization, it was in disarray. The working conditions were not the appropriate ones. There were FBI agents in the premises. Some of his American staff were threatened to be brought into hearings in the US Senate in a committee led by Joe McCarthy, the senator. So he immediately wanted to establish himself as the leader of the organization, the one who had the right to hire and fire. And in that sense, he could protect his staff. He removed the FBI agents, and it became clear who was in charge of the organization. And that also established the integrity of the organization vis-à-vis the outside world. It was very clear that this was an international organization committed to the charter as such, and where he used Article 101 as the basis for his actions. A year later, in 1954, there was a situation in Guatemala which also showed how he acted internationally with the same moral principles. A democratically elected government had nationalized some land property belonging to American companies. It created a crisis in the country. An invasion followed from the neighboring country, Honduras. Clearly sponsored by the CIA, and as the US perceived the situation, this was a communist government, but it was elected. So Hammarskjöld acted to bring this to the UN Security Council. The United States objected to this, instead preferring to put it to the OAS, Organization of American States, where they had the control. And Hammarskjöld clearly argued why this should be a case for the United Nations. But the Americans postponed the actions, prolonged the deliberations, so that the government could be overthrown, and by that sense there was no case any longer. But Hammarskjöld's position was made very clear, and the Americans understood it. The net result still was that he was rebuffed by the United States, and it looked like a failure for Hammarskjöld's ambitions.
What am I afraid of? If they hit their mark and kill, what is there to lament? Others came before, and others will follow.
They remained radio silence, except from a few short messages to the tower in Salisbury and the tower in Ndola at a late stage. There was real fear about attacks from the air, from a small jet aircraft, Fuga Magister, based in Katanga, that had caused some trouble to the UN. Therefore, the captain flew around Congolese and Katangese territory instead of directly from Leopoldville to Ndola. Dag Hammarskjöld was not in a safe position at this flight. The UN had no air force support in the Congo at this time. The jet fighters was provided by the Ethiopians for the UN were not allowed to enter the neighboring states.
Hammarskjold asked London for overflying rights for the fighter aircraft which he hoped to get from Ethiopia to the UN operation in the Congo. The reason for this need was that the Katangan forces had at least one fighter, Fuga, which was causing the UN great trouble. Hence, Hammarskjold wanted to get his own aircraft. Unfortunately, this was exactly the time when London was very cross with Hammarskjold about what was going on in Katanga, and therefore some delay ensued. But then Britain agreed to grant the overflying rights, communicated the decision to New York, but by that time Hammarskjold was dead.
Mr. President, I regret that it has been necessary for me to call again the attention of the Security Council to the problem we are facing in the Congo. I would have hoped that through full, active and immediate cooperation of all those concerned, we would by now have reached a more advanced stage in the implementation of the Security Council resolutions than we have, and I would have hoped that we would not have come to what temporarily may appear as a deadlock, requiring the consideration of the Council. I said that I would have hoped for active support from all those concerned. Such support has only partly been forthcoming, and I must note that the lack of support has been registered from quarters which I might have expected to act differently.
Even a member of the United States government, and a very well-known member at that, had personal interests in the diamond business in the Katanga. Now, that gives you perhaps an idea of the real forces that were obstructing the work of the United Nations in the Congo.
Hammarskjöld's relations with the United States was complicated. There was the FBI affair, there was his opposition to the way Guatemala was handled, and by the end of 1954 a new situation emerged which demanded his attention. This was a situation where American pilots had been held in China, in the People's Republic of China, which the United States had no diplomatic relations with. But the Chinese authorities refused to give them to the Americans. There was a lot of attention on this in the United States, and the issue was then given to the Secretary General, probably in the expectation that he would fail, but the American authorities would protect themselves. Hammarskjöld took on the challenge. He used his background as a Swedish diplomat. He used the Swedish connections with China. Sweden had recognized China. And in this way he could establish a direct relationship to the Chinese leadership. And to the surprise of many, he succeeded in making a visit in Beijing in the end of 1954.
During this visit to Peking, the question of the release of the American pilot prisoners was raised, and it ended in the release of all of them. In this way, Hammarskjöld proved that he was not the tool of either superpower. The Chinese made an offer which Dag Hammarskjöld found quite generous and sincerely believed in, that the American families could come to China and visit their sons. This, however, was turned down by the US government, which refused to issue visas for these families to go to China.
flight of 6 to 7 hours. 10 minutes past midnight, Captain Hallenqvist reported he was overhead in Ndola and descending. At the airport, there was a welcoming party consisting of the world press, of Lord Alport, the British High Commissioner of Rhodesia, and the Moist Shambe, the rebel chief.
Well, first of all, they had no interest in preventing the plane from landing. They were there to meet the plane, and as they saw it, and I think correctly, Hammarskjöld's journey to meet them on that turf, which was basically hostile to the UN, was caving in. He was doing what they wanted him to do, and what was subsequently done, that is, making peace on terms that allowed Shambe to resume in the Congo.
There was no tape recorder at Ndola Tower, which there should have been. So we don't know exactly what happened between the tower and the plane and in the plane. The last contact with the tower was 10 minutes past midnight. We don't know what happened next.
Tired and lonely, tired till your brains hurt, fingers numb, knees trembling. Now's the time, now you must not fail. Tired and lonely, fingers, brains, now not fail.
The wreck was found on Tuesday, the 18th of September, and Dagens Nyheter had a correspondent in Ndola and reported in the morning of the 19th of September. It was, of course, met by shock and total disbelief by the Swedish public. Dag Hammarskjöld was a very well-known person, almost a prime minister, and it was believed by the Swedish public then that the aircraft was shot down by the Katangista rebels of Mr. Shambe. And indeed it was very hard to believe that the Secretary General just disappeared. The aircraft was seen over the tower and then didn't land. Lord Alport, the British High Commissioner of Rhodesia, he concluded that Mr. Hammarskjold probably had gone somewhere else. And the airport manager, he just closed down the airport and went to bed.
At 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 sergeants went up to the airport manager, Williams, who was staying at the hotel, and reported that they had seen a glow in the direction where the aircraft disappeared. And at that time, probably most of the crew already was dead, except for Sergeant Julian, who was Dag Hammarskjöld's bodyguard. And subsequent investigations have revealed that he probably could have survived if they had started the rescue already in the morning.
So what they did was they closed down the airport. They announced that it seemed that Hammarskjold had gone home, had gone back to Leopoldville. They suggested this. They believed me to be with him, and they believed this would have been my advice. It would have been my advice, actually, but I wasn't on the plane, fortunately for me. So when it crashed, as I say, they panicked, closed down the airport, got out, and the search didn't begin. This was the middle of the night. The search didn't begin until rather late the following morning. And by the time they found the wreckage, the only survivor was dying and died without being able to tell people what had happened on the plane.
They started searching in the wrong direction. And not until 3 charcoal burners reported the site of the crash, they started the rescue at the site. And these charcoal burners had been working out in the forest during the whole night, and they had seen what happened, and they unanimously reported that they had seen 2 aircrafts in the air. One bigger, evidently Hammarskjöld's aircraft, and a smaller one.
When before the airplane was first coming, yes, the airplane was like what the airplane was. Oh,
Joshua,
yeah.
normal.
No,
normal.
Then when it turned back, went back to Zaire, it was right. When that small airplane was falling on top of that, and the forward we saw that the small was felt something like a fire on the top of that.
Down to the big airplane.
Yeah, and when we saw that, and the airplane was returning back, and has no power to move long distance, and it fell down.
Well, there was actually at least 8 eyewitnesses of the crash. 4 of them were charcoal burners that was located out in the forest, and another 4 was white officers, police officers, that saw the glow of in the direction of the crash. And actually the charcoal burners tells that they have seen a smaller aircraft going up above the bigger aircraft that obviously is Hammarskjöld's aircraft, and then they catches up with it before the procedure turn, and out there are a few of the charcoal burners that tells that they see the smaller aircraft following the bigger aircraft all the way until it crashes.
I have no doubt in my mind that we saw the plane circle because the place where we were living, it is even today in the airport corridor. All the planes either come and land straight or they circle. In this case, a plane circled. And then I say we because I had some friends, saw a second plane, which I sincerely believe interfered with the first plane. Some minutes later, there was a thunderous sound, which we couldn't make out it was.
Some of the African eyewitnesses was included in the Rhodesian report, but in that report they tried to make everything to make them unreliable and try to disregard their statements.
It was incredible that all the black witnesses were supposed to be unreliable. And the white witnesses, those who gave evidence, if they gave evidence in favor of the fact that there was nothing fishy, it was pure accident, were reliable.
What I do know is that the day the news of his death reached the capital, Leopoldville, the Belgians there arranged a series of parties to celebrate the event, and even had the cheek of inviting me and my wife to participate. Unbelievable, the hostility against the UN, in other words.
I don't believe it can have been an accident because there are too many eyewitnesses and too many indications in the documents that I have read that indicate that it must have been some kind of interference of a third party.
Big interests were involved. For example, the federal government, for example, mining companies at that particular time, both in Zambia and in Zaire. All these were interested. Perhaps big power rivalry couldn't be ruled out either. All this were, I think, that which made some people not to give evidence as they should have given. Perhaps some people had their interest to safeguard. People like myself and the charcoal burners had nothing to safeguard but to tell the truth.
One may wonder who the people could have been who might have had an interest in killing the Secretary General, and to that I would say at first hand, the first thought of mine anyway, goes to this peculiar, wild, reckless, moralless group of mercenaries who were paid well and who loved to kill anyway, who had proven their inclinations in other countries, in other contexts, who were paid very well. If you want to probe a little bit deeper, there were also strong financial external interests in the Katanga copper mines and other mineral resources, which might have found those mercenaries useful and easy tools to employ for eliminating Dag Hammarskjöld.
les les anciens des Nations Unies
When the old United Nations people used to meet up, we'd say to one another, "What about you? Do you believe it about Hammarskjöld's death? The United Nations report?"
nous n'allions pas au...
But that was all. We didn't say any more.
Et puis, un jour, il s'est trouvé qu'un journaliste...
And then one day, a journalist from the UPI agency, United Press International that is, a Frenchman, called me up. No, in fact, if I remember well, I met him one evening at the opera. And so, of course, we shook hands. And he said to me, "Guess what? A guy came to UPI yesterday who claimed to have incredible information. He claimed to know under what circumstances Dag Hammarskjöld really died in Katanga."
De la mort de Dag Hammarskjöld au Katanga, et qui cherchait à
This man wanted to negotiate a price to sell us the information.
de ces informations. Et
And the journalist,
chef du bureau,
who was the bureau chief or deputy bureau chief, I don't know,
j'ai dit,
said to himself,
ce qui va nous raconter,
"There'll be no way we'll be able to check what he has to tell us.
vérifier. En plus, une agence de
A press agency has to be very careful."
Mais j'ai
But he said, "I've got an old friend," meaning me,
pensé à moi, qui a été
who
au
worked with
cabinet
Dag
de
Hammarskjöld,
Hammarskjöld. Peut-être sera-t-il intéressé.
who might be interested in meeting this guy.
Il m'a donc dit, je t'appellerai demain.
So he said to me, "I'll call you and give you his name. And if you agree, I'll give him your phone number so he can call you and then you can tell me what you think of him."
After several postponements, the meeting took place in the evening of Thursday the 13th of February. They said that they were what is called foreign volunteers in Katanga. They don't call themselves mercenaries. The Katangese army's main structure was constituted by these foreign volunteers. These mercenaries were really head of the Katangese army. They said that there was an intimate link between the foreign volunteers and some European personalities. The great boss of the foreign volunteers was Lieutenant Colonel Lamouline. He was a former major in the Belgian army and was attached to the Katangese government. The idea was to use two planes to meet Dag Hammarskjöld's plane. They planned to use two Fugger Magister biplanes, two-seaters. The Fugger type was a CM-170, equipped with two machine guns and four rockets. The range of action was given as 1,400 kilometers. The two Fugger planes were ordered to proceed on a night mission. This night of the 17th of September was clear. The weather conditions were perfect. The two Fugger Magisters left and went on their way to the region of Ndola. In fact, not the two Fugger Magisters intercepted the plane, only one. The name of the pilot was De Boykels. De Boykels was vertically over Dag's plane and had switched on lights and had called Dag Hammarskjöld's plane, ordering it to fly to Kamina. Dag Hammarskjöld's captain or radio operator had replied that he must check with his passengers. The DC-6 looked as if it was hesitating, but anyway continuing its maneuvers to land. De Boykels turned off his lights and started firing his machine guns, not to bring down the plane, but to make the tracers visible and thus show that he meant business. Some of the bullets had hit the tailplane, where you have the rudder. The DC-6 seemed to be wandering. The pilot of the DC-6 was trying to fight against this wandering, and it's then that the plane crashed in the forest. De Boykels immediately returned to Kolwezi, where he arrived at 01:05. He'd been taken to Kamina, where the court-martial had been led by de la Mouline, together with a few representatives of Union Minière, somebody who De Boykels thought was a representative of the Belgian government. Mr. de Camolaria had related this meeting to the Swedish ambassador. They had arranged for a Paris meeting. Mr. de Camularia claimed that such a meeting took place on the 15th of November 1974, but there's been no confirmation of this from the Swedish diplomat. There are also reports that Prime Minister Palme was briefed on that day.
Apparemment, les autorités suédoises, sans avoir fait
Apparently, the Swedish authorities, without having carried out any investigations on the spot, but on the basis of information they had been able to obtain, considered it wasn't true and decided not to follow up what I had suggested. Who could carry out an investigation now to find out the truth? The United Nations? They've already done one. It's very rare to reopen an investigation, but why not? Or the Swedish government. After all, the man who died was Secretary General of the United Nations and the most illustrious child of Sweden and modern Europe.
Hammarskjöld loved solitude. Whenever he had time, he went for long walks in Lapland. And later he bought this lonely estate at the southern coast of Sweden, a few miles from Ystad and a few hundred meters from the sea. According to his last will, all his possessions in New York were brought here to Backat, without changing the character of the house. It was plain and simple, and that's how it remains. Hammarskjöld planned for a chapel on the hills near the sea, a very simple chapel, without favoring any special confession, just as he had done in New York. Because of his sudden death, it was never completed. And today there is a meditation place just behind the dunes.